Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents How to Slay a Dragon, Building a New Russia After Putin, by Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Narrated by Perkins. Preface. It was Mark Zakharov's cult film, To Slay a Dragon, that gave me the title of this book. In that film, the archivist, in justifying his conformist views to his knight, said, "The only way to get rid of someone else's dragon is to create a dragon of your own." And that's exactly how we live. First of all, we tolerate for a long time being tormented and oppressed by somebody else's dragon. In reality, it's our own, but it's an old one. Then we finally rid ourselves of it, and create a new dragon of our own. But after a while, this one, too, gets old, and we stop regarding it as ours. I am absolutely convinced that this vicious circle of Russian history can be broken, and that Russia is fully capable of living with its own mind and its own conscience, and without dragons. But in order to do this, the young knights of the revolution must bear in mind that it's not enough simply to slay the old dragon, even though this in itself is no easy task. It is vital also not to end up bringing to power a new dragon, and one that may prove to be even worse than its predecessor. This book is about how this can be achieved in Russia. As a country, we're in a difficult situation. Society already understands that we cannot go on like this, but at the same time we're frightened that things will only get worse. Everyone in power, besides the president, realizes that there isn't a good way out, but everyone still hopes that maybe it will all blow over. The opposition has an overwhelming desire to sweep away the regime, but has no concept of what then. Because of this, I believe that the time has come to explain clearly to the people what we're proposing and what answers we're offering to life's key philosophical questions. People have the right to know what to expect if they stand alongside us, and particularly what the principles are for which it's worth giving up a quiet life and risking their freedom and the safety of those dear to them. But there is one thing we can say for sure. The time for burying your head in the sand and for turning a blind eye to the most serious social issues, that time has gone. We don't care about politics. We're only concerned about people turning our yard into a dumping ground. We don't care about politics. We're just against abuse of power. We don't care about politics. We're just concerned about artistic freedom, corruption, free access to the Internet. Yes, the time for such quaint doublespeak has gone. If you don't care about politics, then just stand on the sidelines and wait. Maybe the dragon will be in a good mood and will give you something out of the kindness of its heart. But, given the way things are today, it's more likely that it'll kick you down and take your last crumb. But if, on the other hand, you really want to stand up for your rights and the rights of others, then that means getting involved in genuine politics. It means making choices, and it means confrontation, with all the risks that this brings. I occupy a unique place among the ranks of the opposition. True, this doesn't exactly make me jump for joy. I have huge managerial experience, having worked in the government and at the head of a number of the country's largest companies that were of strategic significance to the country, and that were linked to dozens of towns and villages that were devoted solely to these industries. But, despite all this, I am deprived of the opportunity to carry out practical organizational work on the ground. When they kicked me out of the country, the authorities slammed the door shut behind me and turned the key, making it absolutely clear that in the event of my returning, I would face the rest of my life in prison. At the same time, I am one of the very few who has personal experience, we could say, fortunately, very few, for this experience comes with a high price, who has actually told Vladimir Putin to his face exactly what I think about corruption at the highest levels of government. And just a month after doing this, I faced criminal charges and ended up being locked up for more than 10 years, 6 in a prison cell and 4 in labor camps. Added to which I staged 4 hunger strikes, including 2 when I refused to take even liquids, and I carried out all of them until my demands were met, and, in the case of 3 of them, as a sign of solidarity. 10 years. That's almost as much as my friend Platon Lebedev. It's immeasurably less than my colleague Alexei Pichugin, who's still in jail. It's easier than the fate that befell another of my colleagues, the lawyer Vasily Alexanyan, who only a year after his release died from a disease for which he was refused treatment while in prison. I have something to put before these authorities, some things that will be remembered and some things that must never be forgotten. But that is exactly why I don't want to talk about the past. Rather, I suggest that we think about the future. I don't believe I have the right to choose between justice and mercy, to forgive or to refuse to forgive those whom I consider should be punished. I certainly don't consider myself to be the bearer of the ultimate truth. Each one of us has his or her own experience, our own scores to settle, and our own thoughts on the future. But by virtue of the way in which my mind works, I have decided not to talk in terms of how it wouldn't be bad if we were to change those who are in power, but rather to discuss a practical plan of action as to what to do after Putin. From the way in which I think of time, and I look on time differently after the period I spent in prison, I believe that this regime does not have much of it left, no more than 5 or 10 years. How it will end, I don't know. Probably together with Putin. After all that has happened in Ukraine, I find it very difficult to imagine that he will step down of his own choice and live out however much time God grants him on some paradise island somewhere. He simply won't be allowed to do that. One way or another, this regime will meet its end. When it does, there will be so much that will have to be put right, and it has to be done quickly. It would be wonderful if, when this moment arrives, society has already decided who we are and where we're heading, in which direction the road is leading in this rapidly changing world. Introduction. My path into politics, and what I hope to achieve. Politics was never important for me in and of itself. Before I found myself locked up, I was involved in politics only inasmuch as I needed it for business. In other words, simply to achieve those economic goals that were my priority at the time. Then came prison. Prison is hardly the optimum place to discuss politics, but it's a good place to receive a political education. And this was what I earnestly strove to achieve when I wasn't occupied with the other tasks that are put upon you when you're in jail. At the very end of 2013, Putin took the decision to release me. Even though, as they say, hope springs eternal, I considered the likelihood of such an outcome to my 10 years of incarceration as highly improbable. To this day, I genuinely have no idea what guided Putin's thinking. No doubt there were a number of different reasons. There was the forthcoming Winter Olympics in Sochi, which he knew had to pass off in exemplary fashion. Then there was the personal request from the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, which he calculated might lead to some sort of reciprocal concession. And, of course, there was the human emotion of compassion for my dying mother, for whom this would be the last chance to see me. I was aware of all of these reasons and weighed them up while rapid preparations were being made for my expulsion from Russia. I understood, too, that without Putin's goodwill and wish for this to happen, I would never be set free, and also that his decision upset a lot of people in his circle. Therefore, even though I honestly warned the FSB, Federal Security Service officer who came to collect me, that I did not intend to hide myself away from people and keep silent, I had absolutely no intention of becoming involved in politics simply to seek personal revenge. As far as I was concerned, my account was settled in my personal relationship with Putin. He had sent me down, thus depriving me and my family of 10 years of my life. Yet he had also saved my life. Looking back on matters now, it's perfectly clear that, had he not acted as he did then, I would have been confined behind bars to the end of my days. So when I said after my release that I didn't intend to get involved in politics, I was completely sincere. I never had any desire to be involved in politics just to prove something to Putin, and that's still the case. Paradoxically, Our personal relationship worked out in such a way that I even owe him something. He could have killed me, but he didn't. He could have left me to rot in jail, but he didn't. I haven't forgotten this. I planned to engage in targeted human rights and educational activities. It seemed to me that there was sufficient scope to employ my talent and my experience in these fields, and my money could also be very useful. But the more I became involved, the more intensely politics infiltrated into everything I touched. What had happened? What was it that convinced me to turn away from my initial firm resolve not to return to the world of politics? In order to answer that question, I have to explain what I understand by political activity, and what my motivation is to engage in it. In the exact and only possible sense of the word, politics is a struggle for power. Not necessarily power for oneself, it can be a struggle in support of someone else. If the meaning and the aim of political activity is not for power, then it's not politics. It's fake. Or else the person making such a statement is simply not being honest with themselves and those around them. People fight for power for two reasons. For some, having power is an end in itself. For others, power is a tool for achieving other aims. Putting it simply, you can divide politicians into pragmatists, who need nothing more than power itself, and ideologues, for whom achieving power is simply the start of a process. These divisions are, of course, relative and not absolute, but it is useful to bear them in mind. I was never interested in the concept of power as an end in itself, or as an attribute of the alpha male, or as the possibility to dominate and enjoy an inflated position in the social hierarchy. I've been at the very top of society, and at the very bottom too. I have long understood that formal power, there for all to see, is sometimes worth very little, and that real power, which is often hidden from public view, bears no relation to a public position in politics. For reasons that will be obvious, I was never interested in using politics as a way to get rich, either. I was, and remain, sufficiently wealthy not to have to think about where my daily bread was coming from, and in any case, no one can ever earn all the money in the world. But this wasn't the main point. I've always been very wary, and remain so, of people for whom politics is an end in itself. The problem is that such people have no convictions, nor can they have. Convictions would have made them vulnerable, and made it difficult for them to achieve their goals. In general, other things being equal, it's easier for an unprincipled person to come to power, as they are unencumbered by any considerations. Such a person can be in favor of Soviet power at one moment, and at the next against, and in either situation they usually win. When there are too many politicians like this, society tumbles into a long period of crises. Politicians who have convictions are a different matter, although, here too, nothing is simple. If fanatics come to power, holding ideas loaded with hatred for certain groups of people, then they become a threat not only to their own society, but to mankind as a whole. Nevertheless, the world would remain stubbornly patriarchal if we didn't have people in power who hold convictions that express the desire to change society. So the issue as to whether or not I should be involved in politics always brought me back to the question as to whether or not I held worthy convictions for which it made sense for me to go into politics. In other words, to fight for power. Not necessarily for my own personal benefit, but for the benefit of those forces that my convictions supported. When I was released from prison, I didn't see any particular reason as to why I should become involved in politics in Russia. I held the same general democratic opinions that were supported by hundreds of thousands of other Russians with liberal-minded views. Naturally, I agreed with virtually nothing in the political course that Putin was pursuing, but I wasn't unique in that. I could express my convictions simply by supporting those whose opinions were close to mine, and this is what I did, even when I was in jail. There was absolutely no need for me to get involved in politics to do this. I didn't think that I could add anything substantially new or different from what others were already saying and doing. However, the situation changed shortly after my release. Literally 2 months after I was forced to leave Russia against my will, the country became a very different place. Or, to be more precise, it went back to being what it had been before Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika. It was as if the coup plotters of August 1991 had been resurrected and had finally decided to create an alternative version of history. The unsuccessful attempts to crush the revolution in Ukraine, which were followed by Russia's seizure of Crimea, which in turn was accompanied by the igniting of a war in the Donbass, all these events turned everything in Russia on its head. In the space of just a few months, politically, Russia was thrown back decades. The first and most important reset had taken place. Putin and his circle wiped away everything that my generation had achieved when we supported Gorbachev's and Yeltsin's attempts to change Russia. This went way beyond my personal conflict with Putin. Now we were talking about a fundamental difference in our views on the fate of Russia, its past, its present, and its future. It was this that motivated me to become involved in politics, in a way that I hadn't intended to, neither when I was in prison nor at the time of my release. It came down to a very simple idea. I had to defend the beliefs and ideals of my generation of revolutionaries, to make it impossible for Russia ever again to give up its future by turning back to its past and falling into the same rut from which, through enormous efforts, we had managed to drag it out at the end of the 1980s. But how can we do this? For the majority of those who share my views, the answer to this question sounded, and continues to sound, very straightforward. Remove Putin and his clique from power. It sounds tempting, of course, but in reality it's not that simple. We got rid of Stalin, but Stalinism has returned. We disposed of Brezhnev, but stagnation has returned. We even overthrew the autocracy, and 100 years later we're living under an autocratic system. I have absolutely no doubts that we can get rid of Putin. In any case, sooner or later he'll depart this life. There are no immortal dictators. But Putinism, Stalinism, and autocracy will keep returning to Russia again and again, just as long as the socio-political and institutional preconditions exist for them. Although it's always easier and more convenient to personalize evil, it's not really about the individuals, but about the objective preconditions that allow anyone who reaches the pinnacle of power in Russia to become a Putin, a Brezhnev, or a Stalin. This works as predictably as the laws of physics. Whether it's a revolutionary, or an innovator, or a liberator who comes to power, they all end up as a dictator, a satrap, and someone who throttles freedom while desperately hanging on to power together with a pathetic cabal of corrupt henchmen. It is irrelevant who this individual is, because the reality of life in Russia breaks anyone. A specific example is that it wasn't a case of Putin breaking Russia, but of traditional Russia crushing Putin under its own weight. It was this understanding that Russia always seems doomed to repeat its own history that led me to seek a proper solution to this threat. Gradually I've come to the deep conviction that the existing form of power in Russia simply maintains the traditional system of autocracy, and that, without revolutionary change, it will be impossible to escape from this autocratic trap. I've come to the conclusion that, given Russia's historical traditions and experience of politics, only a parliamentary form of government would be acceptable. Of course, we're talking here about a proper parliamentary republic, and not the rubber-stamp version that was typical of the Soviet parliament. In Russia, any other form of government, whereby all the executive functions of power are in the hands of the formal head of state, would inevitably sooner or later lead to the re-emergence of an autocratic and totalitarian regime. This would be for the simple reason that the cultural, economic, and socio-political restrictions that prevent a state from sliding into the bog of authoritarianism are simply too underdeveloped in Russia. Any individual, even the weakest, who found themselves at the top of the pyramid of power would not be able to stop themselves from being seduced into crushing that pyramid beneath them. This makes it essential to slice the top off this pyramid. I see my mission as follows: to convince those who share my ideals and wish to see Russia free, not just for a couple of months or even years, but for decades to come, that this can be achieved, but only if we build a genuine federal parliamentary republic in Russia, with a developed system of local self-governments at the municipal level. It is vital to rid ourselves of a dictator. It is vital to investigate the crimes committed by this regime. It is vital to re-establish even the most basic democratic norms in the country, and to bring back justice and the rule of law. And what is even more vital is that this be carried out in such a way that everything we put back cannot be instantly lost once more. That is possible only by moving to a parliamentary republic. Building such a republic in Russia is far more complicated than overturning Putin's regime. It calls for a genuine revolution, one that doesn't simply scratch the surface of political life, but that overturns the very foundations of the traditional Russian way of life. A revolution such as this demands massive efforts and sacrifices. It means taking risks and changing literally everything, from the bottom to the very top. But only such an all-encompassing revolution can provide Russia with the long-term immunity that it needs to rid itself of autocracy and give it the opportunity to build a new way of life suitable for the modern, post-industrial, global world. It's important at this point to explain what I understand by revolution. I am absolutely convinced that revolution in Russia is inevitable, and that it's desperately needed. This doesn't alter my extreme dislike of revolutions in principle, or my deep regret that Russia has gone so far down a historic dead end that the only possible way out is through a revolution. Any revolution represents a trial for a society, even when it brings with it a wonderful future. At the same time, a revolution does not necessarily mean street battles, storming buildings, seizing post offices, bridges, and the telegraph office. Such events are not indicative of a revolution, but of an uprising. Yes, such incidents often accompany a revolution, but they are not essential and, what's more, are not the main component of a revolution. What I understand by revolution is a total reset of the fundamental principles of the life of a society, which completely alters the course of that society's historical development. Whether such a reset of the fundamentals is accompanied by social explosions, or whether it passes off without so much as a whimper, are secondary questions. Most important of all is the result. In my opinion, Russia's move to become a parliamentary republic is only the tip of the iceberg. By parliamentary republic, I mean the country being run by a government made up of representatives of a coalition of parties that controls a parliament constituted by free and fair elections, and which, in turn, represents a genuinely wide majority of society. At the foundation of such a republic lie fundamental changes to the most varied aspects of the life of society, the implementation of which is essential in order that the system of parliamentary democracy remain sustainable and stable. The most important of all these changes is the switch to a genuinely federal system and the self-governance of cities. Only the cities can provide the political basis for a stable parliamentary republic. In the case of Russia, a parliamentary republic and federalism are inseparable from one another. In order to drag Russia out of the rut of autocracy and place it firmly on a stable democratic trajectory, there has to be a move to a parliamentary republic. And in order to ensure that this parliamentary republic does not become yet another facade for autocracy, it must be reinforced by a federal system. This is already a profound revolution. A country that for centuries has been accustomed to see itself from the top down must learn to look at itself from the bottom up. The logic here is simple. There are practically no democratic political traditions in Russia. What there have been are basically anti-democratic. Civil society didn't succeed in establishing itself properly, and today it's been practically wiped out. Even if favourable, close to ideal conditions were to arise, and I seriously doubt that this is possible, the re-establishment of civil society, even to the levels previously achieved, would take years, and this is bearing in mind that the previous level of civil society was very basic. At the federal level, just as at the local level, there is no party system. All the existing parties are either fake, created or dominated by the authorities themselves, or they're marginal groups, united around their petty leaders and holding no serious weight among the majority of the population. In such conditions, from where can a parliamentary system come with the stability needed to be an alternative to autocracy? Where can we find strength in a world of weakness? Only in the regions. It is only the regional elites, with their local interests, their local self-awareness, and their regional links that have been built up over centuries, that have the ability in modern Russia to be the potential subjects rather than the objects of politics. If these elites were to support a parliamentary republic, it would come about. If they don't, it will simply disappear like yet another mirage of Russian history. A parliamentary republic is possible only if there is a proper federal structure, when local finances, and local life in general, are governed by those who live in the locality. Why is the issue of federalism so important for Russia? It's because, with its cultural, religious, and, of course, economic pluralism, Russia can be a unified state only under the cruelest of dictatorships, which crushes and levels out all local characteristics. Without such a dictatorship, it's impossible to bring under a single umbrella places as disparate as Moscow and Grozny, Kazan and Magadan, Kaliningrad and Khabarovsk, St. Petersburg and Kemerovo. If we wish to have even a hint of democracy in Russia, we must allow for the existence of pluralism, and not simply economic, but political too. Incidentally, the Russian Empire that is so revered by Putin's followers was politically pluralistic. For centuries, the thoroughly European system of self-governance in Finland existed alongside the medieval khanates of Central Asia. Democracy in Russia means pluralism, and in modern times, political pluralism can be achieved only through federalism. Achieving this, however, is no easy task. Why is it that Russia has always been an overly centralized state? Because if the center showed any weakness and handed any significant autonomy over to the regions, petty little czars would rise up in these regions, each of whom would prove to be greedier and more evil than the czar in Moscow. So the people would then ask Moscow to help defend them from these regional satraps and the bandits whom they cultivated around them. And the power of the center always relied on this. A weak czar led to strong petty czars, while a strong czar meant the petty czars were weak. How can this vicious circle be broken? There is a way out. We need to introduce a third element, a force that is independent of these two extremes. This is something that everyone knows very well, because it's the very force that in recent years the Putin regime has been trying above all else to crush. It is local, municipal self-governance. A regional governor who's taken power into his own hands, while the centre was looking the other way, can be stopped by an independent and autonomous mayor or head of a local administration. If local self-governance restricts the powers of the regional petty czar, he or she will be obliged to become a regional constitutional monarch. And local self-governance will instinctively seek the support of Moscow, thus strengthening central government. This will help to even out the system, because it will bring in the checks and balances that are essential for creating a genuine democracy. The space for an independent judiciary arises only when this triangle of local self-governance, regional governor, and central government is developed. By definition, the relationship between the three cannot be ideal. There will either be constant war between them, or there will have to be an arbiter acceptable to all. It is absolutely impossible for there to be an independent legal system if the need for it is not recognized by those in a position of strength. Apart from the united local elites, there is no strong side in modern Russia. They've all been squeezed out. The centre, the regions, and local self-governance will need rules together with an arbiter who can ensure that they are followed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?